Our next speaker is our co-moderator, and David is an expert, one of the world's top experts in remediation of nuclear waste and nuclear materials. We're really quite fortunate that he was able to make it here and to share his enormous area of expertise. And there's probably only a handful of people in the world that can even come close to his understanding about how some of these actual final solutions to deal with the nuclear waste problem can be effectively dealt with.
That's awfully generous. Thank you. Well, hi everybody. Y'all going to sleep after lunch? put you right to sleep. All right. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about how to deal with getting rid of radioactive nuclear propagating waste material. And I want to kind of set the stage for this by saying the state of science, big S, is in some disrepute these days because there's a fundamental failure to understand the distinction, I think, between writing about science in fiction and not understanding that, in a very real sense, science is fiction. So, let me illustrate my point. In 1895, Lord Byron said, "It is absolutely impossible for a heavier-than-air machine to fly carrying man as a passenger." And then along came the Wright brothers at Kitty Hawk. And we see these kinds of pronouncements over and over and over. Ideas in science get refined by discovery. Science, in its most fundamental function, is really metaphorically represented by the 11 blind guys who are trying to describe an elephant to each other. Right? You understand the metaphor? That each one of them, from their own perspective, gets to touch it with their hands and smell it and do whatever, and as they try to describe it to their fellow investigators, their interpretation, their point of view is all fundamentally different. So science has now been siloed into so many different little areas of very specific expertise where you know more and more about less and less. Everybody's trying to figure out what the things we observe mean and how they connect together, and the story we tell about it changes over time as the information we obtain becomes more refined and more reliable. Now, science has a real blind spot. Science, as big S, refers to the institution not remediate radioactive propagation by high-level nuclear waste in any meaningful, affordable, scientifically supportable way. That's the dictum of science. That's the doctrine of it. And it's absolutely false. If you go to the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, uspto.gov, and you put a search term in there that has to do with radioactive remediation or radioactive transmutation, you'll find that in the last 5 years, more than 60 patents have been issued. That's just in the United States. There are over 600 patents issued worldwide. A friend of mine, a guy named Gary Vesperman, has just published a book that identifies all of the known legitimate means by which radioactive propagation in high-level nuclear fuel can be remediated. It's a 243-page book, and if you want a copy of it, get a hold of Gary Vesperman at his email. If you don't have it, talk to me afterwards and I'll give you his email address. It's the accumulation of about 30 years' worth of work done in the private sector with like-minded people who have done really good work. Look, here's how it goes. Dr. Klein told you this morning that when you take fuel pellets made of uranium-235 and thorium-233, you put them inside a zirconium fuel rod Because of the way they behave together, because of the decay cycle, they heat that rod up. It gets super hot. You dip it in water or you pass some kind of a fluid around it and the water gets hot. And it gets hot enough, sometimes up in the 1,000 to 1,200 degrees centigrade range, it gets hot enough to melt most metals. So they have to use real special metals and materials inside these nuclear reactors in order to contain the pressures and the heat and deal with the thermionic stresses. After a while, about 15% into the life cycle of that zirconium fuel rod, something has happened that requires that fuel rod to be removed from the pile and put into the cooling pond. Any idea what that is? Anybody got any notions about that? I mean, if you drive an automobile, you fill up the tank and you only get to use 15% of the gas, and you got to take the gas tank out. What's the problem? What's the problem? Again? No. Look. What is radioactive propagation? What is the emission cycle consist of? What is it? Well, it creates heat, but what's going on? You understand the dynamic of it? No. Here's what I'm trying to get to. If I take an atom of uranium-235, highly enriched, the nucleus is deliberately unbalanced. It has an unequal number of protons and neutrons. And because of the way that thing is structured, because of the refinement process and the way the orbitals operate with the electron fields, the only way this baby can seek to get to a lower, more comfortable, steady state energetically is to get rid of some pieces. The nucleus of a uranium-235 atom is not happy. Those unbalanced neutrons and protons do not play well with each other. And so they expel them. But when the neutrons come off, they're going very fast. A neutron has over 1,800 times the mass of an electron. And when it comes shooting out of the inside, breaking the strong nuclear force, it has a velocity of about 70% the speed of light. That is really fast. So you take a massive, heavy particle and you propel it at 70% light speed. What happens when it hits the nucleus of another atom? It just shatters it. It catastrophically shatters it. And what happens when you catastrophically shatter the nucleus of a neighboring uranium atom? It shoots off a whole bunch more neutrons. You've all seen the demonstration of the mousetraps and the ping pong balls sitting on top of the ping pong table. Well, the only way you can prevent that is by putting things in between those mousetraps to keep the balls from tipping each other over. And that's what the nuclear pile is all about. It mitigates, it moderates the number of neutrons that are allowed to impact other materials. Well, what about this zirconium tube? The reason they use zirconium is because under certain circumstances it is transparent to some of the emissions, but it contains others. Except that after about 15% of its life expectancy, when those neutrons hit more and more and more of the nuclei of the zirconium atoms that make up this very dense crystalline lattice called metal, what happens to the metal? You now have a phenomenon that is called neutron embrittlement. And neutron embrittlement then so sufficiently degrades the integrity of the tube that if they don't take that tube out of the pile before it's too late, the damn thing will come apart. Then you really have a problem, because then you've got a whole bunch of free particles, an inch square, flying around down inside the nuclear pile, made up of material that can't be moderated. It's free down there. But when it gets out of control and you get those fuel pellets all aggregated together in the bottom of a tank and it doesn't have any water left, what do you get? You get a core meltdown. And that's what's happened at Fukushima. They have a core meltdown there. Look, in 1984, at Savannah River, they began storing high-level liquid nuclear waste from their atomic power plants in stainless steel spheres, 20 feet in diameter, the wall thickness 2 feet thick. Within 10 years, by 1984, those stainless steel containers were leaking. Why were they leaking? Because it was bad stainless steel? No. Because neutron embrittlement had so thoroughly fractured the crystalline lattice that they no longer contained the fluid. And the fluid began to leak out onto the ground. So the Department of Energy awarded a contract to Westinghouse. And that contract, over a period of 8 years, consumed $465 million at last count, at which point Westinghouse announced, one, they had not succeeded in extracting 1 cubic centimeter of particulated matter out of the water. They pretended they were going to use all kinds of means to take the particles out of the water, but after 8 years they said, well, we weren't able to do any, and if we can't do it, it's impossible. The next year, in 1994, it became departmental policy at the Department of Energy to encapsulate high-level nuclear waste material in vitrified ceramic materials so they could transport it across the country by truck and by train and bury it under Yucca Mountain in Nevada. Now, was it a coincidence that Westinghouse said that we can't fix it? Or was it a coincidence that Yucca Mountain came along just after they figured out that couldn't be done? Or after the scientific establishment made such a big brouhaha in the press about, how they were going to solve this huge problem. We've got to contain this stuff inside vitrified ceramic, and we're just going to put it on trucks and trains and ship it across the country right through the middle of Main Street and take it to Nevada and bury it under the ground underneath the strata. Well, there's a little problem with that. The big guys are interested in doing